Lena Mercer had never been the type to seek out conflict, but she had long since stopped running from it. At 48, she had endured the slow collapse of a marriage that had begun with mutual admiration and ended in calculated silence. She had raised other people's children, buried both parents without the presence of a sibling to lean on, and endured a layoff that forced her to reevaluate not just her finances, but her sense of purpose. When she signed the deed to the small, time-worn house on the edge of Bramble Hill, she wasn't chasing peace. She was staking a claim on space that would be entirely hers, free of compromise. The house was nothing special from the outside, a modest single-story home with paint faded from too many summers, a patchy front yard, and shutters that hung just slightly crooked. But it had bones. The kind you could reinforce, not replace. The kind of structure that could take weight and history and time without giving in. Lena had chosen it for exactly that reason. The previous owners had left behind just enough junk to be inconvenient. A broken treadmill in the garage, bent curtain rods, and a faded kiddie pool shoved behind the shed. She had planned to throw it out. She didn't have kids of her own and didn't see a reason to keep it. But then came the call from her sister's lawyer, a bitter conversation filled with controlled phrasing and the familiar ache of shared disappointment. Her sister, with her recklessness and bad decisions, had lost custody again. This time, it was different. This time, the court didn't allow another chance. And just like that, Lena became the temporary guardian of Ava, a quiet, observant 7-year-old girl who spoke in full sentences but rarely more than once. Lena didn't hesitate. Not because she had been waiting to be a mother, but because no one else would say yes. The pool, cracked at the rim and sun-bleached, was dragged out and cleaned, filled with cold hose water and set on a patch of backyard that got just enough morning sun. Lena didn't expect joy, but Ava seemed lighter around the water, even if she never really splashed or laughed. She would sit at the edge with her toes dipped in and trace figures in the water with a plastic spoon, murmuring stories that Lena could never fully catch. There was peace in those moments, even if brief. Lena set up a small umbrella next to it, bought a cheap plastic deck chair from a garage sale, and began forming habits. Early mornings before the heat got sharp, afternoon breaks with cold tea, evenings where the hum of insects and the smell of chlorine created the illusion of order. She first met Karen Foster on a Thursday morning when the air was already thick with humidity. Lena had just turned off the hose and was adjusting the cover over the pool when a clipped, polished voice came from the other side of the wooden fence. "Morning," the voice sang, pleasant, bright, and a little too rehearsed. Lena looked up to find a woman in her late 50s, standing precisely in the center of the back gate that separated their properties, as if measuring the exact distance she was willing to bridge. She wore a linen blouse, spotless white pants, and sunglasses large enough to make her look detached. Her short blonde hair was curled into the kind of shape that required both money and time. In her hand was a small container with scones or cookies, something baked, homemade, but clearly intended as currency. "I thought I'd stop by and say hello," Karen continued, stepping through the gate without waiting for permission. "I like to meet all the newcomers, helps keep the neighborhood friendly." Lena wasn't sure what to make of her. She didn't smile exactly, but nodded politely. "Nice to meet you. I'm Lena." Karen extended the baked goods and glanced past her toward the pool, one eyebrow arching in a way that seemed almost involuntary. "So sweet," she said, her voice dipping slightly. "I remember when my boys used to play in a little thing like that. Of course, back then we didn't worry about sun exposure or filtration." She laughed at her own remark. Lena took the container, not out of gratitude but obligation. Karen's presence had the unmistakable feel of a performance. Not for friendliness, but control. What followed were 2 weeks of passive interaction. Karen appeared at odd intervals, often when Lena was least in the mood, when she was folding laundry on the porch, spraying the weeds along the fence, or sitting with Ava on the steps. Karen's comments always had a double edge. "So many kids in this neighborhood," she said once. "I hope yours isn't too shy. The others can be a bit wild." On another day, "Your backyard's charming in a sort of casual way. It's refreshing. Not everyone cares about symmetry." Lena didn't respond much, and Karen didn't seem to mind. She filled silences with stories about her boys, who never seemed to visit, and her poor dog Samson, who was aging and required special shampoo and custom food. "Sensitive skin," she explained. "The vet says it's like having a toddler again." The first real violation came on a Sunday morning. Lena and Ava had gone to a weekend market just outside of town. They returned in the early afternoon, both carrying bags of produce and cheap crafts. Ava had a small painted rock in her hand, her prize for being quiet and patient. Lena unlocked the back gate and immediately knew something was off. The cover had been moved. The hose, which she always left coiled, was stretched out and dripping. The water in the pool was cloudy, and at the bottom, thin strands of dog hair floated like algae. The plastic toys had been knocked to the side, and a half-empty bottle of canine shampoo sat beside the chair. Lena froze. Ava stood silently, her fingers closing around the painted rock. Karen's voice floated over the fence, casual and oblivious. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "Samson was just miserable in this heat, and it's not like I can lift him into the tub anymore. I figured your little pool wouldn't mind one quick rinse." She laughed, a sound meant to disarm but sharp at the edges. Lena didn't reply. She placed the bags down on the patio table and took Ava inside. She didn't clean the pool that day, she left it, a visual reminder of the fact that someone had crossed into her space not with malice, but entitlement. That night, Lena sat at her kitchen table with a mug of tea gone cold. She didn't cry, didn't pace, didn't make a plan. She sat and thought about the line between neighborly and presumptuous, about people who smiled while they took from you, about what it meant to be alone in a place full of fences and smiles that didn't mean anything. She didn't hate Karen. Not yet. But she understood her. She had met dozens of Karens in her life, in offices, at PTA meetings, in waiting rooms, women who spoke sweetly while keeping score, who offered help like leverage, women who believed they were owed grace because they baked and decorated and called you dear. The next morning, she drained the pool, scrubbed it clean, and dragged it into the shed. When Ava asked why, Lena said, "Because people don't always respect what's not theirs." Karen didn't ask about the pool. Instead, she brought over a note and a bag of dog treats. The note read, "Sorry for the mix-up. Hope this smooths things over. I believe in good fences and better neighbors." Lena didn't respond. She installed a lightweight metal barrier along the back section of the yard. Not tall, not threatening, just enough to be unmistakable. It wasn't a warning. It was a statement. One that Karen chose to ignore the following week, when a sudden summer rain began to wash dirt and debris from Karen's sloped backyard directly onto Lena's lawn. The water moved with lazy aggression, carrying clumps of grass, cigarette butts, and soggy mulch down into the space where the pool had once sat. Ava stood at the window and watched. "Is she doing it on purpose?" she asked. Lena didn't answer right away. She looked at the mess, then at the slope of the land, then back at her own fence. "Not yet," she said, "but she will." It wasn't a threat. It was a forecast. The morning began like any other. Dry heat settling early over the neighborhood, the whir of distant lawnmowers forming a lazy background hum, and the faint scent of freshly trimmed hedges mixing with the bitter tang of hose water. Lena had just finished hosing off the back steps and was settling into her usual rhythm, sorting the mail with one hand while cradling her mug of lukewarm coffee in the other. Ava was inside, watching one of her muted morning cartoons and tracing shapes into her cereal bowl with that same soft, distracted intensity Lena had come to expect. It wasn't supposed to be a significant day. The stillness of it, the banality, was almost a comfort. But comfort, as Lena had come to learn, was often the prelude to violation. She didn't hear Karen approach. There was no bark, no click of the gate, no warning creak of the fence latch. One moment she was alone in her backyard, staring at a flyer about community garden registration. The next, Karen's voice sliced through the heat like an arrow wrapped in velvet. "You've really let this space breathe," she said, and though the words were technically complimentary, the tone carried a subtle sting that never failed to land. Lena turned to see Karen standing just inside the rear gate again, this time without even the courtesy of knocking or announcing herself. She was wearing wedge sandals, navy capris, and a pale blue tank top with a barely visible logo from some local wine-tasting event. Her dog, Samson, was absent, though the leash was still coiled loosely in her hand, as if to imply she had just come from some legitimate walk rather than from nosing around the fence line. Karen gestured broadly toward the backyard. "I love that you took the pool down. Frankly, those things always make a yard look cluttered. Plus, standing water attracts all sorts of pests. You wouldn't believe what I've had to deal with over the years." Lena remained still. She had trained herself not to flinch or respond to the bait. Silence, she had learned, unnerves people who are used to controlling the narrative. Karen's smile faltered, just a hairline crack in her porcelain expression. "Anyway," she continued, "I hope Samson didn't make too much of a mess last week. He really needed the rinse. Old dogs, you know, and the vet bills, don't get me started." Lena nodded once, stiffly. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't enter my yard again," she said, her voice neutral. "Even if the gate's unlocked." Karen blinked, then let out a short laugh. "Oh dear, I didn't mean to intrude. I thought we had an understanding. I mean, neighbors help neighbors. That's the spirit of this community." Her voice lifted at the end, seeking agreement like a handshake she expected to be returned. Lena didn't move. She wasn't in the mood to perform understanding. Not that morning. Not with the distinct memory of dog fur tangled in Ava's water toys and the scent of medicated shampoo still clinging to the air 3 days after it had been used. Karen cleared her throat. "Well, if that's how you feel," she said, softer now, but not kinder. She turned on her heel and walked away, not bothering to close the gate behind her. It hung open, swinging slowly in the breeze like the tail end of a threat. Later that day, Lena went to the hardware store. She didn't speak to anyone. She picked up a chain latch, a gate lock, and a few discreet motion stakes, the kind that emitted a subtle beep when someone crossed the threshold but didn't flash or scream. She wasn't building a fortress. She was reinforcing a boundary that clearly needed reminding. That night, she installed the lock herself, listening to the click of metal against metal with quiet satisfaction. Ava asked her what she was doing, and Lena answered simply, "Making sure we're the only ones in our yard." The girl nodded, then went back to coloring. Neither of them mentioned the pool. It had become a ghost now, a presence defined by its absence. 2 days passed. Nothing happened. The air grew thicker. Clouds teased rain but offered none. The silence felt strained, as if the neighborhood were holding its breath. On the 3rd day, Lena came home from running errands and immediately sensed something was wrong. The side gate, the one she had locked, was closed but not latched. That in itself was troubling. She knew she had locked it. She checked the latch and found fresh scratches along the edge, as if someone had tried to pry it with a tool, but hadn't succeeded. The lock was still intact but slightly loosened, as though someone had grown frustrated and abandoned the effort. She stepped into the backyard and stopped cold. The kiddie pool, the very same one she had scrubbed and stored away behind the shed, was back, full of water, centered perfectly in the spot where it had been before. And in the middle of the pool, bobbing slowly in the still water, was a plastic dog brush. Beside the pool, nestled like an offering, sat a small open packet of treats. The treats were the same brand Karen had offered the week prior. Lena recognized the blue packaging. For a moment, she thought she might be dreaming. The absurdity of it, the sheer audacity, short-circuited any immediate emotional reaction. She didn't yell. She didn't storm next door. She just stood there, watching the water, and waited for the heat in her chest to settle into something sharp enough to use. She dragged the pool to the edge of the yard, dumped the water out slowly, methodically, watching it seep into the dry soil like ink. She picked up the brush with gloved hands and threw it into the garbage bin. She took the treats and left them on the fence post, visible from Karen's kitchen window. She didn't include a note. The message was obvious. The next morning, the treats were gone. The pool was not touched again, nor was the gate. But 2 days later, Ava came to her with her face pale and her fists clenched around something small and wet. "They were in the sandbox," she whispered. In her hands were 3 lumps of wet dog feces, partially buried among the toys. Lena felt something in her rib cage snap. Not physically, not yet, but metaphorically. There are things adults will endure, things they will rationalize, minimize, or ignore in the name of civility. But when it touches a child, even one you didn't plan for, it becomes something else, something primal, something that demands response. She didn't go to Karen. She didn't call the police. She took Ava inside, cleaned her up, and called a pest removal company with an emergency request. "My backyard's been compromised," she said. "I need to sanitize the soil. Immediately." The man on the other end of the line tried to upsell her, but she shut it down. "I don't want treatments," she said. "I want every inch of it hosed, stripped, and treated. I'll pay cash." By evening, her yard looked like a battlefield. Soil upturned, grass scraped back, chemicals applied with industrial precision. Karen watched from her back window the entire time, eyes barely concealed behind sheer curtains. Lena didn't look back. When the work was done and Ava was asleep, Lena went out to the porch with a bottle of beer and stared at the darkened yard. The moon reflected faintly off the raw dirt, and the scent of ammonia hung thick in the air. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number appeared. "Overreaction isn't a good look. We used to be neighborly." Lena stared at the message. No name, no emoji, just implication. She didn't respond. She deleted it, blocked the number, and turned off the phone. She sat there for a long time, beer untouched, the night buzzing with insects and distant sprinklers. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once, sharply, then fell silent. Lena leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She wasn't angry. Not anymore. She was something else, something colder, more precise. Karen had made a mistake. She had confused silence with submission. But Lena wasn't passive. She was calculating. And she was just getting started. The following week unfolded in quiet layers, the way a storm often does before it becomes undeniable. The sky remained hot and dull. The air pressed against the skin like damp cotton, and time moved slowly through the weight of late summer. Lena kept to herself, as she always had, going about her business with the silent discipline of someone who had learned that predictability was a form of control. She worked from her laptop most mornings, made lunches from scratch, and spent time with Ava doing puzzles or painting small river stones they found on their weekend walks. But in the back of her mind, something simmered. Not rage, not even vengeance, but a sharpened awareness that nothing around her was as safe or neutral as it once appeared. The signs were subtle at first. A trash bag left open by the curb that she distinctly remembered sealing. An empty bottle of window cleaner in her bin, a brand she didn't use. A small patch of grass near the back gate that turned an unnatural shade of yellow overnight, as if treated with something meant to burn. Nothing she could prove. Nothing dramatic. But it was there. The unmistakable scent of escalation. Karen had not spoken to her since the text message, at least not directly, but that didn't mean she had gone quiet. Instead, she had taken up a new habit, standing on her back porch in the early evenings, wine glass in hand, phone to her ear, speaking loudly enough for her voice to drift over the fence like an oil spill. "Some people just don't understand neighborhood etiquette," she would say. Or, it's about respect. You give an inch, and they build a fence. Sometimes she pretended to be talking to her son, who, to Lena's knowledge, had not visited once. Other times she would call out to an unseen friend, describing in detail how difficult it had become to feel comfortable in her own yard. Lena never responded, but she noted everything: the tone, the timing, the subtle way the phrases seemed chosen more for her than for whomever Karen was supposedly addressing. Then came the morning with the toy truck. It was one of Ava's favorites, a small yellow dump truck with chipped paint and a missing wheel that she refused to replace. Lena had last seen it under the maple tree, near the sandbox they'd begun to rebuild after the soil treatment. Now it sat on the front step, its plastic shell cracked down the middle, its bed filled with wet ash and the charred remains of what looked like paper. There was no note, no explanation, just the truck, broken and fouled, left like a warning. Ava stood behind her, barefoot and quiet, her face unreadable. "Was it Karen?" she asked softly. Lena didn't answer. She bent down, picked up the truck, and carried it to the garbage. She didn't curse, didn't fume, didn't even tremble. She just closed the lid and went inside to wash her hands. That afternoon, she made her first call. Not to the police, not to a lawyer, but to a landscape consultant. Someone she had found online after an hour of quiet research. The woman, Marlene, answered on the third ring and agreed to come by the next morning. "I need water management solutions," Lena said when asked for the reason. "Flood prevention, directional flow, containment." Marlene didn't question it. She sounded professional, detached, and thorough. The kind of person who focused on systems rather than people. When she arrived the next day, she carried a tablet and a measuring device and said very little. She walked the perimeter of the yard, made notes, tested the soil. Lena explained what she needed without giving reasons. A drainage route that directed excess water toward the lowest part of the shared boundary. Reinforced fencing that wouldn't rot. An irrigation line that could run in reverse. Marlene nodded throughout, never prying. "We'll install a subtle slope from here to there," she said, pointing. "You'll want a retaining trench, maybe some gravel or soft stone. It'll look decorative. No one will question it." Lena agreed to the plan and paid in full. The work began 2 days later. Karen, of course, noticed. She watched the digging with the same proprietary interest she might have shown a new boutique opening on her block. At one point, she even called over the fence asking if Lena was putting in a koi pond or something. Lena didn't answer. The workers didn't engage. The trench was dug, shallow but effective, and lined with stone. A sub-drain was installed beneath the lawn, concealed beneath a new layer of sod. The slope was gentle, almost imperceptible, but enough to ensure that if water ever pooled, it would know exactly where to go. Lena didn't explain any of it to Ava. She simply told her to stay out of the backyard until the project was done. Once the work was completed, she waited. Not with impatience, not with hope, but with the quiet certainty of someone who understood that pressure didn't need an audience to build. And sure enough, the following weekend, it came. A summer storm rolled in just after dusk, thick clouds bursting with moisture, thunder rumbling like a distant threat. Rain fell in heavy sheets, the kind that blurred vision and drowned out sound. Lena stood by the back door, watching the water rush through the trench, curl around the edge of the lawn, and funnel straight toward the shared fence. She saw the way it pooled beneath the slats, how it darkened the base of Karen's neatly painted deck. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She simply watched. The next morning, Karen was out early, stomping around her yard with a scowl, her pristine sneakers soaked and muddy. She barked into her phone, paced back and forth, and glared over the fence as if daring Lena to explain herself. Lena met her gaze once, briefly, then turned away. Later that day, Karen left a printed note in Lena's mailbox, typed, signed, and double-spaced. It accused her of intentional redirection of stormwater, of backyard vandalism, and of creating a hostile living environment through aggressive landscaping. It included phrases like pending legal review and actionable nuisance behavior. Lena read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it into a folder labeled Correspondence, Karen. Then she went to the hardware store and bought 3 bags of cedar mulch and a decorative hose nozzle shaped like a dragonfly. If Karen wanted a war of inches, Lena would give her one measured in gallons. Over the next few days, things shifted. Karen began talking to other neighbors more often. Not privately, but loudly, theatrically. Her voice carried across the lawns as she told stories of water damage, of neighborhood disputes, of that woman who thinks she owns the whole block. She described herself as a victim of passive-aggressive bullying, called for community standards, and hinted at legal intervention. Lena said nothing. She continued watering her plants with deliberate efficiency, making sure to stop when the ground was just damp enough to hold. She adjusted the trench once, adding a slight curve to redirect overflow toward the area beneath Karen's deck stairs. She installed a timed irrigation valve and programmed it to run early, before dawn, so that any pooling would be discovered after it had already done its work. Karen's next move was pettier. She began dumping birdseed just over the fence line. Not a lot, just enough to attract a small mob of pigeons and grackles that tore up the mulch, clawed at the soil, and left droppings across the stepping stones. Lena swept them away each day, never saying a word, but she began tracking the seed. She found the thin line where it had been thrown, noted the trajectory, and adjusted her camera to capture it. She wasn't building a case. She wasn't planning to press charges, but she was recording the weather, and Karen was the storm. One morning, Ava asked her why they didn't just move. Lena considered the question carefully. "Because you don't run every time someone acts like they own what isn't theirs," she said. "Some people need to learn where the line is, and I've drawn it." Ava didn't reply, but later, when a bird landed on the porch rail, she shooed it away with unexpected force. The line had been drawn, and soon it would be crossed again. This time, Lena would not just redirect the storm, she would answer it. The heat continued, unrelenting and dry, baking the neighborhood into silence during the afternoon hours and encouraging a brittle, uneasy calm that made every creak of the porch boards and every sudden rustle of leaves feel like an interruption. Lena had grown accustomed to the patterns now, not just of the weather, but of the neighbor whose presence lingered like mildew, subtle, invasive, hard to entirely remove. Karen's behavior had grown less frequent in its obvious forms, but the tension between them had changed shape, become something quieter and heavier, like fog just beneath the surface of normalcy. The trench in Lena's backyard was now part of the landscape, the gravel settled and the flow lines working precisely as planned. Rain came and went, and with each storm Lena observed the pooling along the fence, the slow trickle beneath Karen's deck, the slight shifts in wood coloration that told her moisture was beginning to take root in places it shouldn't. It wasn't sabotage, it wasn't even direct action. It was a natural consequence of poor design meeting strategic redirection, and Lena never touched a thing that wasn't hers. Still, she knew it wouldn't go unnoticed forever. The first indication that Karen was preparing her counterstrike came not from anything she said or did, but from the arrival of a stranger in Lena's yard one morning. A man in slacks and a pressed button-down shirt, clipboard in hand and a badge clipped to his belt that identified him as a municipal compliance officer. He approached the house with careful, formal politeness, his tone neutral, even sympathetic, as he explained that a complaint had been filed regarding unapproved landscape modifications and improper water redirection. Lena listened without reacting, then asked to see the complaint. The document he handed her was printed on plain paper, filled with vague language about water runoff, drainage codes, and potential erosion risks to adjacent properties. There was no mention of Karen by name, but the phrasing, neighboring structures of historical integrity, adjacent decks vulnerable to subsidence, and possible non-permitted grading work made it painfully clear who had authored the accusation. Lena didn't argue. She simply requested time to gather her documentation, and the officer, clearly more bureaucrat than enforcer, agreed without protest. After he left, Lena pulled out the folder she had kept since the first installation day. The invoices from Marlene's work, the soil reports, the water flow assessments, all legally sound and fully paid. She scheduled a call with Marlene that afternoon and calmly relayed the situation. Marlene, as always, was unflustered. "Let them inspect," she said. "We followed code. If anything, your setup improves soil retention. Just don't touch anything until they're done." Lena agreed, but even with the reassurance of legality, something in her shifted. Karen had escalated beyond passive tactics. She was now bringing in structure, using rules and red tape like weapons. It was no longer just neighborly hostility. It was a campaign. The inspection was scheduled for the following week, and in the days leading up to it, Karen became unusually quiet. Her porch remained empty, the wine glass missing from its usual place on the railing, her voice absent from the twilight air. Lena knew better than to mistake silence for surrender. Karen was waiting, and she was confident in whatever seed she had planted. The inspection itself was quick, professional, and ultimately uneventful. The same compliance officer returned, this time with a different badge and a colleague in tow, both of them taking notes and asking questions in the same monotone cadence that suggested they had no interest in drama, only in process. Lena walked them through the work, provided the documents, and even offered them bottled water from her kitchen, which they accepted without comment. By the end, they assured her that unless further evidence was presented, no action would be taken. Lena thanked them, watched them leave, and finally allowed herself a breath of satisfaction. Short, but meaningful. That breath was interrupted 2 days later by a new development. Ava had gone to spend the evening with a classmate, and Lena was using the quiet to catch up on emails when a thudding sound from outside drew her to the back window. At first, she thought it was just wind. Then she saw it. Karen, standing near the fence, wielding a hose in one hand and directing a steady stream of water at the gravel line along the trench. She wasn't watering plants. She wasn't rinsing anything. She was flooding the edge deliberately. The stream too forceful, too focused to be anything but an attack. The water pooled against the rocks, sloshed over the edge, and splashed toward the base of Lena's fence, reversing the trench's intended flow. Lena didn't react immediately. She watched, silently, her fists tightening at her sides. Karen turned toward her once, catching her eye, and offered a faint smile. Detached, clinical, victorious. Then she turned off the hose, coiled it slowly, and walked back to her porch as if nothing had happened. Lena didn't go outside. She didn't confront her. Instead, she sat down at her desk, opened a new file, and began documenting. Time, date, direction of flow, weather conditions, photographic evidence. She wasn't compiling it for court. She wasn't planning to call authorities. But she understood now, with complete clarity, what she was dealing with. Karen wasn't trying to win. She was trying to provoke. She was prodding the fence, looking for a place where it would bend, for a weakness that would justify whatever came next. Lena didn't intend to give it to her. That night, Lena reprogrammed the irrigation system. She adjusted the timers so that a short burst of water would spray gently onto the trench at sunrise, not enough to flood, just enough to wet the rocks and restore their line. She replaced the gravel Karen had shifted with a slightly heavier mix, one less susceptible to splash back. Then she took a roll of thin copper wire and ran it just beneath the soil on her side of the fence, looping it into a discreet grounding rod. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't visible. But if Karen tried to repeat her little water display near electrical fixtures, she'd be in for a surprise. But the real shift came not from Lena's preparations, nor from Karen's aggression, but from Ava. That weekend, Ava returned from a birthday party holding a gift bag she hadn't brought with her. Inside was a note, unsigned but written in cursive, old-fashioned, deliberate. "Little girls should play elsewhere," it read. "This isn't a place for noise." There was no question who had written it. Lena didn't say a word to Ava. She didn't cry or panic. She simply took the note, placed it into the folder, and added a label to the tab. Phase 2. She wasn't just protecting her property anymore. She was defending her blood. Karen had stepped over the line, and from that point on, every action Lena took would be precise, deliberate, and irreversible. There comes a moment in every prolonged conflict where the pretense of civility shatters, not in a spectacle of violence or confrontation, but in a quiet and unmistakable shift in tone, where gestures stop pretending to be polite and words lose the softness of plausible deniability. For Lena, that moment arrived the morning she discovered the irrigation line severed. She had woken up early, long before Ava stirred, to enjoy a rare moment of solitude with her coffee on the back steps. The air was still cool, the sun just beginning to creep above the roofline, casting soft gold against the fence and making the dew shimmer across the lawn. She had stood up, intending to check the trench for pooling, when she noticed that one section of the yard was suspiciously dry, bone dry in fact, with grass beginning to crisp at the edges. A short inspection confirmed what she already knew in her gut. The line had been cut clean, the incision too straight to be accidental, the ground above it barely disturbed. Someone had known what they were doing. Someone had taken their time. Lena didn't say a word. She didn't curse or panic. Instead, she went inside, retrieved her tools, and fixed it herself. Digging, splicing, resealing. It wasn't about the repair. It was about the message. She knew who had sent it. The next move came faster than she expected. 2 days later, while Ava was at school and Lena was working in her front office, a utility truck pulled up outside the house. At first, she thought it was another inspection. But when she stepped outside, clipboard in hand, she found 2 men walking the property line with a rolled-up parcel and a can of marking paint. One of them introduced himself as a property line assessor, hired for a neighbor-initiated boundary clarification. Lena didn't need to ask which neighbor. Karen had escalated from complaints and sabotage to a full-scale territorial maneuver. She asked to see the paperwork, which they provided without argument. Standard forms, municipal stamps, nothing illegal, nothing overtly aggressive, and yet everything about it reeked of malice wrapped in procedure. The men were polite, professional, even apologetic. "These things usually don't lead to any changes," one of them said, "but we've got to walk it, just to be thorough." Lena stood back and let them work. She didn't argue, didn't interfere. But when they left, she requested a copy of the assessment, made 3 duplicates and placed them in separate files. One for personal use, one for Marlene, and one, though she hoped never to need it, for legal escalation. Karen was trying to redraw the map, and Lena knew enough about war to recognize that the battle had entered its territorial phase. Karen's campaign continued with increasing brazenness. She began speaking openly to other neighbors in the street, not even bothering to lower her voice. She referenced runoff water that smelled like chemicals, accused Lena of harboring unsafe structures, and at one point loudly lamented the suspicious lack of parenting supervision occurring in certain backyards. Lena heard these statements, second-hand at first, from the grocer, from a barista, even from Ava's teacher, who cautiously asked if everything was all right at home. Lena realized then that Karen wasn't just playing for personal satisfaction anymore. She was attempting character assassination. She wanted to poison the well, to isolate Lena socially and morally, to create a narrative in which Lena was unstable, unfriendly, unsafe. It was an old tactic, refined through years of suburban warfare and cocktail party gossip, and Karen was using it masterfully. But what she hadn't accounted for was Lena's patience, nor her refusal to engage publicly. Instead of lashing out, Lena invested in upgrades. She installed a gray composite privacy fence, tall, elegant, impossible to see through. She replaced her backyard lighting with soft but strategic ground-level fixtures, angled away from Karen's house but bright enough to prevent any late-night trespassing. She hired Marlene again, this time to reinforce the trench, doubling its width and lining it with crushed basalt stone that drained faster and left no surface water to critique. It looked beautiful, clean, even artistic. It also happened to redirect water with surgical precision. The night after the trench was completed, Lena heard the hose. It was faint at first, a distant hiss like a snake coiled in the dark. She stepped outside onto her porch and immediately saw the beam of a flashlight flicker on the other side of the fence. Karen, standing in a robe and slippers, was watering her own yard at 2 a.m, deliberately aiming the hose upward so the spray would arc over the new fence and land near the trench. Not flooding, not directly damaging, just undermining. Just enough to say, "You can build your wall, but I'll reach over it." Lena didn't speak. She stood in the shadows and watched until Karen noticed her. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the pretense dissolved. Karen didn't smile. She didn't wave. She simply turned off the hose and disappeared back into her house. That was the moment Lena decided she would no longer wait. She retrieved the old pool, the one Karen had used without permission, the one she had cleaned and stored and tried to forget. She filled it again, carefully this time, positioning it near the fence but not against it, visible but not confrontational. She set up a small bench beside it, placed Ava's water toys in a neat row, and then left it untouched for 2 days. Karen saw it, of course. She walked past it during her daily perimeter checks, stared at it from her window while sipping from her wine glass, commented on it to passing neighbors. "It's back," she said, as if announcing the return of an invasive species. But Lena wasn't inviting confrontation. She was baiting certainty. And on the 3rd day, Karen took it. Lena had gone out early, leaving Ava with a neighbor she trusted, citing errands. She returned just before noon and found the pool empty, the bench overturned, and a faint residue of soap clinging to the inner rim. A plastic bottle of dog shampoo sat on the grass nearby, open and half-used. Lena didn't speak. She didn't even enter the yard. She went inside, changed her clothes, and returned with a garden hose fitted with a precision nozzle. She didn't spray the grass. She didn't spray the fence. She aimed for the base of the Karen's porch, specifically the small gap where the wooden planks met the concrete foundation, where she had seen the water pool before. She turned the hose on slowly, adjusted the pressure to a steady, concentrated stream, and held it there. 5 minutes. 10. 15. She shifted the angle slightly every few minutes, ensuring full coverage. She didn't do it in a rage. She didn't mutter curses or threats. It was methodical, unblinking, the same way one might clean a stain from a sidewalk. By the time she stopped, the lower half of Karen's porch was soaked. Water dripped from the slats, pooled beneath the steps, and ran along the path toward the side yard. Lena coiled the hose, wiped her hands, and returned inside without looking back. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the heat gave way to sticky twilight, she heard the yelling. Karen shouting into her phone on the porch, angry and frustrated and, for the first time, uncertain. The porch had begun to swell. The wood had darkened unevenly. A soft smell of mildew was already creeping up the boards. Lena sat inside, calmly slicing vegetables for dinner, Ava beside her, humming without realizing it. For the first time in weeks, the house felt still, safe. The next day, a man in coveralls appeared at Karen's house, a contractor by the look of him. He knelt, inspected, shook his head. Karen stood over him, arms crossed, silent. Lena watched from behind her curtain. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply noted the time, the posture, the way Karen refused to look toward her house. It wasn't about winning. It was about establishing gravity, about showing that for every inch taken, there would be consequences, measured, lawful, inarguable. The kind of consequences that rotted foundations, not reputations. That night, Lena opened her file, labeled every incident with a colored tab, and filed it away in the cabinet she'd installed for long-term records. She added a new label to the drawer: Flood Phase. This was no longer about lines or gossip or property. This was erosion, of power, of entitlement, of the illusion that some people are untouchable. And erosion, she knew, didn't happen in a day. But once it started, nothing could stop it. It was the sound of hammering that woke Lena before dawn, sharp and irregular, echoing off the houses like a signal meant for no one but heard by everyone. At first, disoriented by sleep and the heaviness of the early heat, she thought someone was working on the street. But when she stepped outside in her robe and sandals, the source became immediately clear. Karen, standing in a floodlight on her back. Porch, directing two workers who looked half awake and fully irritated as they pried up waterlogged boards with crowbars and hauled the splintering remains into a rusted trailer. The air smelled of rot and cheap pine sap, a combination that clung to the lungs and made the entire yard feel humid with decay. Karen didn't look at her, not even as the boards were dragged noisily across the yard, exposing the muddy, darkened earth beneath, already soft with oversaturation. Lena stood there, arms crossed, silent until one of the workers nodded at her politely. She gave a tight nod in return and went back inside, not because she was intimidated, but because she had no interest in turning the act of watching into performance. She already knew what this was: damage control dressed as renovation, a public display meant to reframe the narrative before someone else defined it. The porch was being rebuilt, but not because Karen had changed her ways. It was being rebuilt so Karen could say she was fixing what someone else had broken. Later that day, a knock at the door broke the quiet rhythm of the afternoon. Lena answered, unsurprised to find a uniformed city employee standing there, clipboard in hand, smile thin and professional. He introduced himself as a representative from Property Code Enforcement, citing an anonymous complaint about unauthorized water dispersal and structural endangerment to adjacent residences. Lena asked to see the complaint, and he showed her the document, once again vague and bureaucratically worded, but clearly tied to recent events. The timeline was obvious. Karen had made her move, and now the official channels were in motion. Lena calmly invited the man into the backyard, walked him through the drainage setup, provided the inspection forms, soil certifications, and water use statements she had neatly prepared. Her documentation was impeccable. The trench was visible, clean, undisturbed. There was no illegal rerouting, no unnatural engineering. The system functioned exactly as designed, harmless, legal, and effective. The officer made a few notes, snapped some photos, and thanked her for her time. "This looks like a neighbor issue," he said quietly, not unkindly. "We'll close it out, but it might be worth keeping track of these patterns." Lena didn't need to be told. She already had. The file drawer was full, categorized, dated, and color-coded. She didn't collect the evidence because she was scared. She collected it because sooner or later, Karen would misstep in a way that couldn't be argued out of existence. That moment came quicker than expected. 2 days after the inspection, Ava came home from school with her backpack unzipped and her drawings, her careful, shy little sketches of cats and houses and trees, missing. In their place was a printout, folded twice, placed deliberately inside. Lena unfolded it, her stomach tightening even before she saw what it was. A neighborhood petition, filled with typed complaints about noise, about water hazards, about unwatched children, all unsigned but formatted as though prepared for submission to a governing board. It wasn't official. It wasn't even functional. But it was placed with the kind of precision that told Lena exactly where it had come from. This was no longer just between her and Karen. Karen was trying to drag Ava into it. That line, Long suggested, now finally crossed, erased the last boundary of restraint. Lena didn't scream. She didn't knock on Karen's door. Instead, she made a call. She didn't call a lawyer or the police or any authority Karen might expect. She called Brian Colton, a private contractor she had used once years ago for post-storm yard restoration, a man who specialized in excavation and knew how to move earth without drawing attention. He arrived the next morning, boots dusty, truck loud, attitude blunt. Lena explained what she wanted. He didn't ask why. "You want a full perimeter flush?" he asked. She nodded. "I want saturation at every pressure point. I want the water to settle deep. I want it to speak." Brian didn't smile, but he respected precision. He gave her a price. She paid it on the spot. The work began that afternoon. Over the next 48 hours, her yard was transformed again, not with brute force, but with intention. Brian's team adjusted the slope of the trench, added a secondary channel that passed within 3 feet of the fence, just behind a row of decorative plants. They installed a sub-level basin filled with high-absorption soil and fitted a calibrated slow-release nozzle attached to the main irrigation line. Hidden, quiet, impossible to detect without digging. When activated, the system would simulate a heavy storm, directing moisture precisely toward the weakest part of Karen's new porch foundation. Not to destroy, not to flood, to remind, to show, to make her feel the presence of consequences she had thought would never touch her. Lena waited until Karen's workers had finished, until the new boards gleamed with sealant and the fresh paint dried into a color called antique driftwood that looked nothing like real wood but photographed well. She waited until Karen stepped onto the porch that evening, wine in hand, smile restored, eyes scanning the neighborhood with smug entitlement. Then she turned on the system. From inside her house, Lena watched the monitor. Low-res black and white infrared that picked up thermal changes and ground saturation. The soil beneath Karen's porch darkened slowly, methodically, evenly. No gushing, no spray, no visible attack. Just water, creeping, weighty, unstoppable. Karen didn't notice the first day, but by the third, she did. A hairline crack appeared in the baseboard. One corner of the railing began to warp. The smell returned. Not strong, not yet, but present. A wet, earthy odor that seeped through the new paint and made the air around the porch feel heavy and wrong. Karen paced. She barked at her contractor over the phone. She examined the boards with a flashlight at night, crouching low, sweating through her silk robe. And all the while, Lena remained silent. She did not taunt. She did not gloat. She simply maintained the flow. By the end of the week, Karen had a second contractor out, then a third, then city personnel again. No one could explain the moisture. No leaks, no faulty installation, no rain. Just water that wouldn't dry. A presence that couldn't be traced. Lena turned off the system 2 days later. Not out of mercy, but timing. The message had been delivered, and Karen, for the first time, retreated. Her porch was roped off. Her wine glass was absent. Her gossiping ceased. She no longer stood tall at the edge of her property. She looked inward. She stopped trying to win. Lena sat on her back steps the next evening, Ava beside her, both of them sipping lemonade. The trench was dry. The yard was clean. The air felt lighter. For the first time in weeks, Lena heard no footsteps, no muttered phone calls, no coughs that announced someone was near the fence pretending not to listen. There was only the sound of insects, the soft rustle of leaves, and the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing that power didn't have to shout. Sometimes it just had to flow. It took several weeks for the changes to settle into permanence, but Lena noticed them almost immediately. The silence became structural, not temporary, a stillness that no longer felt like the pause between provocations but rather the consequence of a battle concluded. Karen no longer stood on her porch during the evenings, no longer called out to passing neighbors with honeyed concern or thinly veiled grievances. The lawn that had once been obsessively trimmed grew patchy in places, as if the energy for perfection had drained away. Deliveries stopped arriving at regular intervals. Her garden, once adorned with ceramic gnomes and solar lanterns, grew dim and untended. There was no announcement, no dramatic collapse or forced apology, just the quiet withdrawal of someone who had realized, finally, irrevocably, that the territory she had assumed was hers to dominate had become resistant ground. The porch, after weeks of investigation and failed diagnosis, was declared structurally compromised, though no one could quite explain why. Contractors cited unusual saturation patterns. Inspectors mumbled about foundational weakness exacerbated by previous materials. And when Lena overheard Karen on the phone, her voice was hoarse and bitter, railing against incompetence and betrayal, as if the world had collectively turned on her. But Lena knew the truth. Karen wasn't the victim of a bad build. She was the product of a system that had always rewarded noise, charm, and manipulation, until it met someone who didn't play along. By mid-September, the demolition began. The new porch, barely a month old, was torn down piece by piece, hauled away in silence by a team that didn't bother introducing themselves. Karen didn't supervise this time. She stayed inside, blinds drawn, curtains closed, her silhouette occasionally visible through the frosted glass of her kitchen window. Neighbors noticed, of course. They whispered, speculated, some with amusement, others with thinly masked discomfort. Lena didn't involve herself in their conversations. She didn't offer explanations or accept credit. She simply mowed her lawn, watered her plants, and waved when Ava ran to greet her after school. Some evenings, a neighbor would linger near the fence looking as if they wanted to ask her something, to get a version of the story that made sense. But they never did. They could feel the boundary now, not physical, but real. Lena's yard was hers. Her quiet was earned. The kiddie pool was never brought back out, not because Ava didn't want it, she had long moved on to other things, but because its presence no longer felt necessary. What had started as a symbol of innocence and intrusion had served its purpose. The patch of lawn where it once stood was replaced with a square of smooth stone, surrounded by low succulents and a single cast-iron bench, positioned perfectly beneath the arc of a small tree that provided shade in the late afternoon. Lena called it the quiet corner, and sometimes when the light was soft and the world had calmed, she would sit there with a book or a cup of coffee, not reading, not thinking, just watching the wind move through the leaves. Ava liked to join her, sometimes with her sketch pad, sometimes with nothing at all. They didn't always talk. They didn't need to. One morning, as the weather turned cooler and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and dried grass, Lena opened her mailbox and found a card. No envelope. Just a folded piece of thick, cream-colored stationery, unsigned with only one sentence written in looping, hesitant handwriting. You made your point. There was no name, but there didn't need to be. She tore it in half and dropped it in the trash without a second thought. That evening, she noticed the "For Sale" sign in Karen's yard. It was small, almost modest, placed at an angle as if trying not to draw too much attention. But its meaning rang out louder than any final confrontation could have. Lena didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply returned to her quiet corner and resumed her seat. The house sold quickly. Within a month, a new family moved in. A couple in their 30s with a toddler and a dog that barked at everything and scared no one. They introduced themselves immediately, brought over cookies, and asked if their fence height was bothering her. Lena thanked them for the cookies, told them the fence was fine, and recommended a local gardener when they asked about landscaping. It was easy, it was civil, it was enough. Karen was never seen again. No dramatic exit, no final remarks. Just absence, as complete and cleansing as a season ending. Her departure wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. There were no medals, no declarations, But for Leni, it marked the end of a chapter written not in retaliation, but in resistance. She had never sought power. She had simply refused to give hers away. In a neighborhood that thrived on subtle wars and petty politics, she had drawn a line and held it with patience, precision, and unwavering clarity. And in doing so, she hadn't just protected her yard. She had claimed peace, not as something granted, but as something built, quietly, permanently, on her terms.